Prison Chronicles is proudly brought to you by the Akin Brewing Company. Akin Brewers is a locally owned craft brewery based in Hornsby, New South Wales. And for a limited time, Akin has put out a special edition beer, the Prison Chronicles Long Bay Lager. So support the podcast and a local Aussie brewer. Go to akinbrewing.com.au to order or visit the brewery on Fridays and Saturdays. akinbrewing.com.au. Beer you love, made by lovers of beer. In this episode of Prison Chronicles, the 1980s saw the AIDS epidemic emerge around the world. There was panic throughout the community. No one knew how the virus was spread. People were living in fear. And in prison, that can be a dangerous game. Welcome to Prison Chronicles, the AIDS Unit episode.
In 1986, I was a senior correctional officer in the Metropolitan Reception Prison at Long Bay. The AIDS epidemic had been in full swing since 1986. And people were dying left, right and centre, either music and media stars, and lo and behold, ordinary members of the public, and also prisoners. Some prisoners were coming in with AIDS, some were acquiring AIDS within the centre. There was a lack of information regarding the AIDS virus, and this generated a lot of hysteria and created panic amongst people, not only in jail, but in public in general. People were terrified. People were washing their hands on a regular basis. They were scared to kiss people. They were scared to have sex with people. But in general, everyone believed that it was a homosexual disease or an intravenous drug user's disease, but that wasn't the case at all. People were dying left, right and centre. The corrective services had no idea how to combat the problems that had generated within the system. AIDS had become a disease that could affect anyone, and people were in a panic. And I can tell you, within a prison setting, that is terrifying, because if that perception is there and spreads to everyone, then those who are carrying the disease could quite easily be killed.
At the beginning of 1987, a graphic television ad began airing on Australian screens, warning the public about the dangers of HIV and AIDS. The ad featured a skeletal Grim Reaper playing 10-pin bowling on an eerie, misty bowling alley, using ordinary people as the pins, and focused on a small, horrified girl clutching a doll as the Reaper's lethal bowling ball rolled directly at her.
At first, only gays and IV drug users were being killed by AIDS. But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it. The fact is, over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead. That if not stopped, it could kill more Australians than World War II. But AIDS can be stopped, and you can help stop it. If you have sex, have just one safe partner, or always use condoms. Always.
Inmates who were identified as AIDS victims were being spat on, bashed with chairs and other items, as other inmates wanted nothing to do with them. The most common way that they were assaulted was with a bar of soap in the toe of a sock, which was swung repeatedly into the victim. The laundry refused to wash their linen. Their food was contaminated. What you need to understand is the kitchen at Long Bay that provides all the meals for the inmates is manned by inmates. They provide around about 3,600 meals per day for all the inmates on the Long Bay complex, but it is the inmates that are cooking these meals. They are minimum security inmates that are supposedly able to be trusted. They man the kitchens, make all the meals, and They know exactly where the meals are going to be delivered around the complex. Inmates have their own justice system, and they had no time for AIDS-infected inmates. They would put feces, spit, sticks and stones in the meals that they thought were destined for the AIDS-infected inmates. Those inmates diagnosed with AIDS, along with the problem of facing the uncertainty of dealing with a terminal disease, became a target from the other inmates. They were scared to use the showers or the visits area in case their families came under threat. They couldn't safely associate with other inmates in the yards. They become known throughout the prison system as those with the dreaded. There was absolutely nowhere safe for them within the prison system. Staff refused to attend to them for any reason whatsoever, even if it was a medical emergency. Such was the fear surrounding the disease. In short, they had become an extremely isolated and persecuted group, suffering the hatred and fear of staff and inmates alike. They had become totally and wholly ostracized.
The AIDS epidemic was a situation that the prison system had never faced before. Inmates were being admitted to jail, infected with a disease that caused panic from both staff and inmates alike. There was fear and paranoia. People were unsure as to how the disease was spread. Being diagnosed as having HIV instantly put a target on your back. And in jail, that can be a deadly game. The HIV-positive inmates needed to be treated for their condition. But what treatment can the prison provide? How do those with the dreaded remain anonymous to ensure their safety from other violent and fearful inmates? A positive result to HIV was the same as a death sentence. What effect will that have on the inmates that receive such grave news?
Things were way out of hand concerning the AIDS epidemic in prisons. The department, in its clumsy way, did attempt to provide sufferers with some extra comforts. A decision was made to provide identified sufferers with extra cartons of milk and blankets. Well, that should stave off the AIDS virus. No need for too much research here. Just give them a couple of extra blankets and more milk, problem fixed. It was supposed to be a closely guarded secret that these prisoners were in fact infected. No one, absolutely no one, was supposed to know that they were HIV positive, except the nursing staff. However, it was so blatantly obvious, as every morning when the milk cartons were delivered to each cell door, every inmate had a single carton of milk, and at another cell door, there would be half a dozen cartons of milk for only one occupant. A blazingly clear indicator of infection. You didn't have to be Einstein to work that one out. And so, one morning, I was called to the superintendent's office, and in his usual gruff tone simply said to me, "Got a job for you, Reedy. You're now in charge of the AIDS unit." Which didn't exist until he said this. "You start tomorrow at the back of 11 Wing. It's got a yard, and it'll be the first in the world. There'll be heaps of visitors, so don't fuck it up." He gave me a crew of 2 female officers and a few male officers that no one liked working with. No special instructions, no plans, nothing.
The old protection unit at the back of 11 Wing was identified by prison bosses as the perfect place for the newly established AIDS unit, not because it could be adapted for the medical care of its soon-to-be admitted inmates, but because previously, as it was a protection unit, it had been proven that inmates could be housed there without any contact with other inmates. A perfect solution for a group of inmates that was suffering from a HIV-positive diagnosis, when no one knew what that meant, to be housed away from other inmates and away from everyone who was wary of these supposedly highly contagious individuals.
The back of 11 Wing is the bottom quarter of one of Long Bay's massive 100-year-old 2-storey brick and sandstone cell blocks, located in the old Metropolitan Reception Prison. Upon opening the main security door to the unit, we looked on in despair. Everything was covered in bird droppings, dust and cobwebs. A TV was mounted on the wall. Its cables hang in long dust-laden loops beneath it. A few water-stained plastic chairs and tables are scattered about, and huge black cockroaches scuttle about our feet. The unit has an internal dividing wall that sections it off from our neighbours, the Special Care Unit, the SCU. The SCU officers despise us. They aren't happy having HIV-infected inmates contained within their precious unit. The officers in the SCU are known by other staff as Care Bears. They are not very popular with the general duty staff, as they are seen as softies. But now, even the Care Bears despise us. They control the entrance and exit door to the new AIDS unit, and are not happy about having to open and close it every time we need to go anywhere, as it means they have to get off their asses and walk to the door and open it for us. They play a passive-aggressive thing and make us wait for ages to get in or out. We are now at the bottom of the food chain, and the Care Bears are a rung higher than us up the ladder. The cells at the back of 11 Wing are narrow, so narrow that if you spread your arms wide, you can just about touch each wall. Crammed into each cell is a steel-framed bed, a steel cabinet, a sink with a heavily scratched stainless steel mirror fixed to the wall above it, and next to that is a seatless toilet. As a medical unit, this place was and still is entirely unsuitable. Our immediate priority, though, was to have the area cleaned. This area hasn't been used for years. In fact, the last time it was used was when it replaced the old observation centre almost 5 years ago. We used to hold high-profile protection inmates in here during their trial hearing. These inmates were generally despised by the prisoner population due to the nature of their crimes. This area was therefore identified as the place for HIV inmates, out of sight and out of mind. Even though the unit was filthy and not suitable and not ready for habitation, the inmates were transferred to the unit immediately. The inmates were given the task of getting the place into some order, which they eagerly set about doing. In general, they were just pleased to be in a place where their safety was assured. We, on the other hand, the officers, were very apprehensive, with all our conversations conducted with paper face masks on and at a distance of about 50 feet. At lunchtime on the first day, the meals arrived, but when we left the containers out to be returned to the kitchen staff refused to touch them. Then, the following day, the kitchen refused to provide meals for us at all. We were forced to purchase takeaway meals for a short while until it was decided to establish our own kitchen within the unit, which at that time was a very, very big deal, given steel knives and other cooking utensils until now had never been allowed in a maximum security prison. 4 days after we opened the unit, one of the 3 inmates died in his sleep. This really unnerved the other 2 inmates, who had it dramatically driven home to them, a view of what was awaiting them, as this disease relentlessly took its toll. Even the staff were numbed by the swiftness of this event, myself included. The staff in the unit were faced with an even more confronting scene, for when the coroner's contractors arrived to collect the body, they arrived in overalls. But before going anywhere near the body, they proceeded to put on a biological life support system with a dedicated air supply to protect them from any possible contamination. The air hoses extended from the truck all the way through the unit and inflated their blue biosuits, making them look like astronauts or deep-sea divers. We, in stark contrast, were dressed in our thin summer uniforms. The coroner's team wrapped the body in yellow plastic sheeting with the words "contaminated material" in large black letters all over it. They wrapped the body several times and sealed it with special yellow sticky tape, then into another bag, and finally zippered into a black body bag that was plastered with contamination stickers and taken away. Absolutely no dignity shown here. Everything in the cell, including the inmates' mail and personal effects, were placed in contamination bags. Then, the coroner's team put a blowtorch to the walls of the cell. And as I watched, one of the contractors said to me, "If anyone has been breathing in here, you had better get them checked out, as the spores may be airborne." By this time, I was wondering just how dangerous working in this unit was. This paranoia became extremely pronounced for me when I attended a medical briefing where the lecturing professor gravely announced, "We may very well be witnessing the end of the human race if we can't get a hold on this disease." Now, I can tell you that statement really boosted my confidence. When I was given the task of opening the AIDS unit, I believed this was going to be a boost to my career. However, upon reflection, the truth was that my staff and I were seen as dispensable by the department. The next drama for us to contend with was that regular prison staff refused to have anything to do with the AIDS unit staff. It became so bad that the officers whom we once considered friends wouldn't sit next to us in the cafe or stop and talk to us on the avenue. If we were walking along the footpath, staff would deliberately cross to the other side of the road and ignore us. Our cars were scratched. Our tyres let down. So now, we, the AIDS unit staff, had become isolated and ostracised. It was absolutely impossible to get any regular staff to work in the unit at all, even on overtime. By the end of the month, we had 10 inmates all suffering from the condition or suspected of having the condition. It was a very strange position to be in, as the New South Wales prison system in the 1980s was in what could only be described as the biggest transitional changes ever to affect it in over 180 years. Staff was still reeling and coming to grips with the Nagel Royal Commission's recommendations.
The Nagel Royal Commission was established in 1976 to look into the management of New South Wales prisons, and its findings were handed down 2 years later. The Royal Commission made several recommendations to improve the conditions that inmates faced when incarcerated. The Nagel report saw the prison system in the 1980s undergo an era of rapid change. The culture of officers not speaking to inmates and inmates not speaking to officers was changed, and a more improved culture of inmate and officer interaction began. But not all officers were happy about it. By 1987, with officers managing inmates that had a terminal illness that was spreading panic not just in prison, but in the wider population, the Nagel recommendations were especially necessary, as officers needed to show some empathy towards the inmates that were in their care. But it certainly wasn't smooth sailing.
Talking with prisoners was a new and very worrying experience for officers. Before this period in time, prisoners did not have a name. They were simply a number. And as far as prison officers were concerned, prisoners were referred to as crims, gronks, crooks, or rockies, all simply desensitizing terms that removed or hid the fact that the prisoner was a human being. However, with the Royal Commission's recommendations, the inmate numbers had gone, and prisoners now had a name and identity and could converse and complain, and now the officers were the ones wearing the name tags. Throughout the history of the prison service in Australia, an officer could be dismissed from the service for having unnecessary conversations with inmates, and inmates had been stabbed by other inmates for talking to officers. However, in this unit, this phobia would have to be overcome and overcome quickly. Then we encountered problems with what could be seen as over-familiarity which was really due to compassion and empathy and the constant working relationship staff developed with the inmates in their care, which so often ended in the deaths of the inmates as they succumbed to the ravages of the virus. We settled into a routine. The inmates were pleased to be away from the threats and abuse they'd been receiving, and we came to know each one of them extremely well. One of our tasks we had to carry out was the regular hospital escorts to Professor D's clinic, which could be a very stressful experience for both staff and inmate. Bloods would be taken, and 6 weeks would elapse before another visit to the professor's clinic was arranged, during which time the inmate had nothing to do but worry about the results of his test, and those thoughts would be all-encompassing. Inmates would plunge into moods of total despair, and then on the other hand soar into euphoric moods. No counsellors or psychologists had been assigned to the unit at this stage, and we as officers were at a total loss as to how to respond to these inmates' needs. We would take them to the Prince of Wales Hospital for appointments with the doctors, and it was common for them to be told, yes, you're positive to the virus, and we would then have to console them. Then, a couple of weeks later, we would return for the follow-up appointment, and sometimes they would be told, sorry, it was a mistake. They didn't have the virus after all. This happened on a far too regular basis. The problem for inmates housed within the unit and found not to have had the virus was that they would be stuck with the stigma of having been in the unit. They couldn't be placed anywhere else for fear of retribution. An interesting aspect of a HIV positive result in the mid-80s was that upon hearing that they had HIV, people would take out enormous personal loans, buying gifts for family and friends, in the belief that they wouldn't have to pay it back as they would be dead soon. When they didn't pay back the loan, they would be charged with fraud, and strangely enough, by being sent to prison, probably receive better treatment than they otherwise would have had if they had been sent to the Prince Henry Hospital, where they would have been placed in the contagious diseases ward, which was no picnic. I once had to visit an inmate who had been admitted to this ward, and was shocked when I witnessed a male nurse showering a skeletal-looking man who was clearly incapable of cleaning himself, and having to endure the male nurse belittling him and his condition.
Hurry up and wash yourself, you piece of shit. Get on with it. You brought this upon yourself. Stop whinging and hurry up.
Here was a guy, in the last remaining days of his life, who had been rejected by his family, all because he was gay, and the nurse simply held a hose on him as though he was washing an animal. I never, ever forgot that. It was around this time the department introduced blood testing for new receptions and discharges to ascertain whether the inmate had caught the virus in prison or had contracted it before imprisonment, simply because of fear of litigation against the department. The one thing we did get, and was totally unexpected, was professional visitors. We had visitors from all over the country and the world, psychologists, psychiatrists, and doctors trampling through our unit, totally unannounced. It was irrelevant to them that the prisoners were in a highly stressed and anxious state, and in some cases, clearly in the process of dying, grieving, or both. The political mileage had to be extracted, even at the emotional cost of others. The AIDS unit was eventually closed and was replaced with a new politically correctly named program called the Lifestyles Unit, and it became the only unit of its kind in Australia to house confirmed HIV/AIDS sufferers, and provided education and support services to each inmate, both while in custody or out. The Lifestyles Unit was closed only a few years later, when a minister's secret boyfriend was discharged from the unit, and strangely, the funds dried up. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine that this all really happened, given that today it's no big deal to people that someone has AIDS. But it had a huge impact on how we provide emergency services, given that our attitudes today are always to treat people as though they have everything: hepatitis A, B or C, as well as HIV. And the AIDS epidemic had a huge impact on how the prisons were managed. Condoms were introduced to the system, and a huge debate began, which still goes on today, regarding a needle exchange program.
Prisoners will always try and get their hands on drugs and drug implements in jail. If an inmate has a working needle and syringe that he has smuggled into the jail, that is a prized possession in the yard, as inmates will pay anything to use that syringe to inject their drugs. Over the years, political parties and social advocate groups have pushed for a needle exchange program in New South Wales prisons to ensure that those inmates who are using drugs aren't sharing those needles and they're not spreading disease. But a tragic incident that occurred at Long Bay in 1990, the first and only occurrence of its type in the world, has highlighted the fact that inmates should never have access to needles and syringes in jail. On the 22nd of July 1990, prison officer Jeffrey Pearce was on duty at Long Bay's Metropolitan Reception Prison when inmate Graham Farlow stabbed him with a HIV-infected syringe. The inmate ran from the scene, yelling AIDS. Officer Pearce, a 21-year-old, was treated by officers immediately, but sadly, Officer Pearce was diagnosed as HIV positive 5 weeks later. The inmate pled not guilty to maliciously administering the virus, malicious wounding and assault, but died of AIDS before he could stand trial. Jeff Pearce returned to work within weeks of his positive diagnosis. He spent his time addressing schools and community groups about HIV and AIDS to educate people about the reality of how the disease was spread. Sadly, on the 31st of August 1997, 7 years after that fateful day, Jeffrey Pearce died from AIDS. After his death, he was awarded an Order of Australia for his work on promoting AIDS awareness. And on the 6th of March 2020, a prison at Windsor was renamed the Jeffrey Pearce Correctional Centre. Prison Chronicles is proudly brought to you by the Akin Brewing Company. Akin Brewers is a locally owned craft brewery based in Hornsby, New South Wales. And for a limited time, Akin has put out a special edition beer, the Prison Chronicles Long Bay Lager. So support the podcast and a local Aussie brewer. Go to akinbrewing.com.au to order, or visit the brewery on Fridays and Saturdays. akinbrewing.com.au. Beer you love, made by lovers of beer. Enjoying Prison Chronicles? Subscribe now for bonus episodes and hundreds of never-before-seen photos from behind the walls. Visit patreon.com/Prison Chronicles podcast and immerse yourself in the full experience today. On the next episode of Prison Chronicles. In Long Bay Jail, there's a prison within a prison called the ACMU. It houses some of the state's most difficult inmates to manage, whose behaviour defies belief. These are inmates that are chronic self-harmers, and a day working in here can be an eye-opening experience. Stay tuned for more Prison Chronicles.